without saying. And when it comes to Godzilla, I think it has a lot in common with butter. So you've got butter, everyone usually likes butter, but if you can't have butter, there's alternatives, right? I can't believe it's not butter is one of them. So in the case of a Godzilla adjacent monster, there's actually a lot of them, and a lot of real life animals as well that end up being Godzilla-like. So as you can see here on this collage, there is a lot of Godzillas, a common term used on TV shows, at least not Godzilla. That's a probably heard before. And a lot of these you probably recognize, but some of them date back really early in human history. So there's that. But first, I just want to get into some terms. I'm a student in math systems, so my primary focus and my actual creative writing. So we're using definition terms here. So what we're talking about is things like archetypes, stock characters, and tropes. Now, archetypes, the term itself originated from Carl Jung, founder of Jungian psychology. He believed that archetypes were these recurring ideas that existed within our subconscious, and they defined who people were and sort of brought about these different personality types that you see. And it wasn't just the fact that they were something you could see in people, but it was something that was recurring across all of human culture. And these different archetypes would reemerge across our stories. And it was something that would later be applied to Joseph Campbell. He wrote Hero of a Thousand Faces. And obviously, Joseph Campbell, he would go on to inspire George Lucas, who made a little sci-fi show, TV show, movie, called Star Wars. So a lot of Lucas's inspiration comes from Joseph Campbell and the hero journey, which is what Campbell really pioneered. And then the last guy there is Northrop Fryer. He was a university professor in Canada. He believed that archetypes and the idea of archetypes was important to interpret stories. He was the one really, besides Campbell, who applied it primarily to literature. But he applied it to things of seasons. And that itself isn't necessarily relevant to our topic here today, but it is interesting nonetheless as how archetypes move out of psychology into writing and how we find characters. Like, I think in common areas, like, here's someone say this is the archetypal, etc. So what oftentimes is the lead like a trope or a stock character. So how to find an archetype is a recurring universal concept that can be found across cultures and time periods. And tropes are elements found across a medium made specific based on the genre, the medium itself, or culture. And then stock characters are often a flat character that does not define itself beyond the basic traits of what it is derived from. So a lot of these characters that we see here are kind of stock characters of the Godzilla archetype, or the Godzilla trope. I'd say actually trope is more happy to say that. A show having giant monsters appear in Tokyo but not being specific to the production could be considered using a trope of the actual genre itself. Now, with archetypes themselves, they were something that was applied mostly to human psychology, and across almost all of human history have stories of monsters. And the idea of the archetype itself, that we never really intended it to be applied to necessarily creatures. I think that it can be stated that there are archetypes to monsters in our culture, and different monsters resonate as a result. And what it proposes is this idea of the wicked ancient as a type of archetypal monster. Now, if you go across the screen, you go from the top left, you go across the down. So the first one is the tiny walk. It is something from all the South Italians. It's again a giant lizard that is awakened, and usually they live in rivers, like sometimes in the sea, but they have an exceptionally hostile relationship with certain humans and others. They are more protective of certain human relatives, almost being like a local deity of some sorts, which can remind you of Now the next one is an ancient picture of the Organ Gunter, the big red serpent from Norse mythology. It's probably more related, or we call it more because of our character, Thor, and how that is the grounding model, which we also see things the fiction of the Leviathan from biblical Bible. And then next is the Jurassic local legend from France. And we'll actually see many different versions of the Jurassic as similar to other character we'll see in just a moment here. The Jurassic has embedded itself into more modern day culture with other means. And then following up on that, kind of a tale of Godzilla, although here originally Japanese legend, you know, for the serpents fighting against Tsunami. And then following that is almost an animal in and of itself, but is next is the Hydra from Greek mythology, Hercules, or more commonly known as Hercules, Roman name. And then following that is the dragon from Silver Origin of Dragon. And next to that is Tiamat, a common name now for the Monsterverse because of Titan's Tiamat. But of course, Tiamat itself is a creature from Egyptian myth. And next to that is a fictional character, so it actually doesn't come from the myth, but rather the literature tale in of itself. It is the dragon from Beowulf. And then finally, ending off on another legend is Smok or Smok Kowalski. It is a Polish dragon, and is also the name of the creature of animal as well. So all of these creatures have a lot of things in common, and what it is they often have great strength and size. They are usually known for devouring humans or venturing near civilization-their domains. A common trope across these stories is that you have civilization environment as well, and outside of that, what is the primal wilderness, whether it's the primal forest, desert, or the abyssal sea, which is why a lot of these creatures are sea monsters, Leviathan, and Tiamat especially. And in those cases, it also is due to their religions as well. Going back to those two in particular, Leviathan itself was either experiencing a lot of flash flooding or it was experiencing a lot of arid drought, which is why other creatures or myths or great figures come from the desert, while primary chaos in the sea is more commonly associated again with the sea monsters. And why this is relevant to Godzilla is that he himself, in his inception, is carrying on these traits and applying them to a more modern lens. So, similar to how these creatures are oftentimes the creations of gods, or where things left behind by gods are not intended to be created. Godzilla itself is a holdover from history. He's not a modern dimensional, although he's enhanced by our mistakes of modern technology. He's a holdover from this ancient past, similar to how these creatures are from this divine age. And similar to these creatures, some of which were either directly venerated, while others who were just feared placated. Godzilla is feared by the villagers of the island. And as he's awakened the army and continues encroaching on the territory, which is another common trait, the dragons enjoy like encroaching on its territory. Like Beowulf, there's one person who steals a cup from the dragon's tube, which is why the dragon rebels and attacks civilization, which is something Tolkien himself would live for the creation of Snow. It's not something for a lot of modern dragons who see contemporary fantasy literature. It's similar to these ancient myths. Godzilla would start to kill eventually ultimately would go beyond that and progress on humanity and destroy civilization. And so ultimately, like in a lot of these tales, you have either divine figures, either gods, or people who are empowered by gods, or their dragons, or Saint Martha, the sister of Mary and Lazarus, that character in the Bible, being what we subdue and ultimately shops and killing his wrath. And in this case, Dr. Sarazawa using essentially the divine tool of Russian destroyer to kill Godzilla. But unlike these tales where usually there's a piece of the political and sociological circumstances of Japan, meaning that there's not the same kind of peace that you see in the world at the end, where we're more concerned about the fact that nuclear testing continues essentially towards boxing zone and another Godzilla with chaos could erupt from this. Now a little bit of preamble out of the way. Let us get into one of the first creatures. This is the Hanyo. Now, what we do know about this is that as a creature, there is complete information. One biggest picture on the left right here. That is an early depiction of it. It's supposed to have come from 1866. The name itself means fruitful year fish or good harvest fish. It is reportedly sighted in Osaka, measuring roughly about 200 meters long. And its overall shape is said to resemble the easel, and its limbs resemble those of a turtle. That's all we know about it, and most of the information you can actually glean from it are from various cryptozoology websites that all reference the exact same source, but in most cases this is the biggest picture on the left is an original picture that was shown in an earlier paper. But what is interesting to note is that this early depiction of the Hanyo is very similar to the storyboard depiction of Godzilla, where not only is the face similar, the body shape is similar, but it also has the same fin-like tail that Godzilla also possesses in this picture. Of course, Godzilla's design is even refined, more resemble contemporary dinosaurs in design, but just interesting nonetheless. And a little picture of the bottom there, that is ancient mythology, and Nathaniel has a character who continues to survive through that game. I don't know particularly much about the game, but it has a lot from myths and legends that creatures I mentioned earlier. Some of them are in that game as well. Another creature, now we're going more into fictitious territory, is Lockrock. Now, Lockrock originates from 1919, 1920. It's a creation of H.P. Lovecraft. Now, Lovecraft is a pioneer alongside R.B. Howard, the creator of Conan the Barbarian, the idea of Weird Tales. Now, Weird Tales was a magazine that focused primarily on horror, sci-fi, fantasy, adjacent tales. But the primary focus was either ghosts, demons, and particularly monsters, or in Lovecraft's case, he was the pioneer of what we know as Lovecraftian horror or eldritch horror. Now, Lockrock itself is similar to a lot of those more ancient myths, where it's a creature that is living in a lake in the land called Nar. And we don't know about it at the time, but it was incorporated into his dream cycle. And at least at the time, it was believed that Nar was either someplace either in the Middle East or somewhere like just on planet Earth rather than like the dream cycle itself. Now, Lockrock, unlike traditionally where these creatures were worshipped or venerated by humans, Lockrock is a creation and a worship by the Thunhog, the voiceless ones, which are these frog animals. And ultimately, the Thunhog are slaughtered by the people of Nar, who create the city of Sardak, which gives the city the name, the dune that came to Sardak. As every couple or so years, they would continue to essentially venerate the destruction of the Thunhog and the destruction of the city in which the Thunhog lived. And so ultimately, Lockrock is finally aroused and ultimately destroys the city of Sardak, carrying it to the ground. And only a few people able to witness just a small, like, reptilian shape descend back into the lake where Lockrock descends as well. And what is similar to Godzilla in this case, besides just being a big lizard who lives in the lake, is the fact that an important theme of the Dune King of Sardak is this idea of unchecked violence, as well as fires of retribution coming to claim those who have brought such destruction. I know one thing is a hot button issue when it came to Godzilla Minus One when it came out was how to portray Japanese soldiers and come to terms with some of the actions that they committed, which is not talked about as much in a lot of critics discuss that. And I think that in this case it is a similar theme to something that should be talked about a little bit more. And then issue two is that the picture on the left at the bottom, the suit one, that is actually from Ultimate Gaia episode 5. That's a picture of Mom, right? Or although when it's talked about, it sounds like Mom as well, we just replace the with an A. But even during that time, the Hasty pictures were borrowing a lot from the Lovecraft mythos, especially the Legend of Tiga, where Blade was mentioned. Tenozoa was similar to Tenothoa. So Lovecraft was definitely on the minds of people in Japan, but more specifically, in this case, I think Lovecraft really does show a lot of Godzilla, at least in small and minor ways. But what really shares a lot more in common with Godzilla is dinosaurs. So dinosaurs were dinosaur-like monsters, these giant monsters resembling dinosaurs, rampaging across cities, was really popular in the 1800s into the 1900s. So we have the Death of the Moon, which was from 1929, going across. This one, like a giant dinosaur attacking Washington D.C. with his ray gun. That seemed like essentially quintessential tokusatsu. But this is from Thrilling Wonder Stories in America in 1939 is when this image appears. But it was actually, there was no story in this magazine. This was actually something that someone drew, and they're like, oh, someone submitted a story. And next year in 1940s, where Beauty and the Beast, which is a shame that you call that, would be released. And then there's Dinosaur Destroyer in 1949, and then this comic, which is Adventures in the Unknown in 1950. So, Pretty Short Life was very, very popular, and we'll get back to Beauty and the Beast a little bit later on when we get into the 80s. But this whole idea of dinosaurs, at least giant dinosaurs, a lot of the dinosaurs depicted in here are sized up dramatically from their actual paleontological physiological counterparts, and oftentimes exhibit these traits of wanting to destroy cities, recognizing these structures, and interacting in a way that people think of as being more quintessential Godzilla-like. But I think readers, when it comes to like the first really Godzilla-esque monster, that is the Arctic Giant from 1942. And as you can see, he's battling Superman. And later on, we have Godzilla versus Kong versus the Justice League, which will come out years and years down the line. Now, the Arctic Giant comes from 1942 specifically. It is the fourth Superman short created by Fleischer Studios, the creators of Betty Boop as well as Popeye. It's only 9 minutes, but it covers just a typical Superman adventure. And the setup will be very analogous to the creature we'll talk about in just a moment here, where in the frozen tundra of Siberia, this giant dinosaur is discovered, and they ship it back to civilization. And ultimately, they're using a kind of cooling device similar to like refrigeration, which is also becoming more popular at the time to keep the dinosaur frozen. However, due to cartoon mishaps, the machine starts to malfunction, and the monster unthaws and it begins its rampage across civilization. Ultimately, Lois Lane, who had gone to the museum to report on the creature, is trapped in a bubble, which calls the Superman. And what's interesting to note here is, in the first 3 Superman shorts, this is also the idea of Superman becomes more cemented. You probably heard the idea of leaping tall buildings and single bound faster than a locomotive. That is where this whole phrase of Superman comes from. And it's also, the Arctic Giant is one of the first instances where you start to see Superman fly more commonly, although there is a shot where Superman is bounding over buildings, which is actually made prior to the short, but in order to save time, they use that instead. And we actually see a lot of cases where the Arctic Giant just displays these more Godzilla-like traits where you have it going after trains and breaking bridges similar to that of Godzilla 2014. There's a shot where he's poking his head over this whole mountainside, similar to that one shot in Godzilla vs. Mothra at 64 at the end of the movie. And ultimately, Superman is able to do the Arctic Giant, and ultimately it's now put in the zoo rather than in the case of the museum. And what is interesting to note about the Arctic Giant in particular, besides the fact that big green dinosaur with theropod traits that is very similar to Godzilla, is that it's actually in the public domain now. There was a lot of mishaps when it came to how Fleischer handled these Superman shorts. And for one reason or another, all of the shorts ended up in the public domain. So when it comes to how the public domain works, I'm a lawyer, I'm really on TV, I'm not so witness, so don't ask me all those questions, but in a lot of cases, if a character is entirely in the public domain, they aren't free to use, which the picture on the top left there was one I done a little while back of the Arctic Giant. So if you guys feel like writing an Arctic Giant story, you are within your rights to do so because it's in the public domain. But we move further into the 50s now. This is probably more common territory for the Foghorn and the Beast. Now, with the Foghorn, it was originally published in Saturday Evening Post following 2 lighthouse keepers whose foghorn attracts a giant sea-dwelling monster. Now, in the original story, the description of it isn't very descriptive. It's almost like, you could describe it as almost like a dinosaur or something closer to the Rhinoceros itself. But there is enough detail to where you can get an image as to what it looks like. But the image in the bottom left corner there was the original image they showed for the Saturday Evening Post. And the one opposite to it on the far right was done by famous East European paleontologist Nathaniel. And Burrian's work would also be a huge inspiration on Godzilla, which we'll see later on. And both of those depictions have the Foghorn creature depicted more as a giant theropod rather than the quadrupedal dinosaurs that we'll get later on. And there's conflicting tales as to whether they knew about the Foghorn prior to these 20,000 fathoms, or they didn't know beforehand, and had asked Ray Bradbury to license the story. And ultimately, one reason or another, the film gets made, it's extremely popular, and around the same time, King Kong got released in 1952. So you have 1952 release of King Kong, 1953 release of 20,000 fathoms. So now you're getting into the age of giant monsters that are more common in cinema, even if Kong's being brought up technically. And the last 2 in the middle, one on the left, this was actually something from later on. It is another depiction of the Foghorn. Instead, it depicts the titular features form of plesiosaur. Although those details aren't mentioned in the story, I think it was just for artistic license. It came from a Ray Bradbury comic series where they were adapting a lot of this that is a Tales of Horror, which is just called The Beast, or The Horror of Beast or the Deep. And it is a loose adaptation, and I don't think it was licensed either, but I guess they were able to get away with it. It was from Toby Press specifically. Now we get into the Japanese side of things with what is known as the Jiro monster, and I'll show you what's on screen, where Kayama apparently culled ideas from his 1952 short story, Jiro Monster, in which a giant bullet-repelling lizard that walks on its hind legs terrorizes primitive people. There's no direct translated version of the story. This comes from the Shiro-Honda-like film by Michael and Shesky, and this was also something that Jeffrey Daniels mentions in his book, including the translation of Godzilla and Godzilla-like again. Now, the picture here, we don't know necessarily for a fact if it actually is the Jiro monster itself, although if you look online and type in Jiro monster, this is the picture that's associated with. And the werewolf rifle and ships and guns information comes from another Japanese Godzilla. I myself am not able to guess. We don't know if it's a source from a source from a source that is maybe not reliable. But even if it's not, there's still a lot of things you can see here going back that there was dinosaur material similar to Godzilla was starting to become more prevalent prior to the 1930s and into the 1930s itself. Now, we finally get into Godzilla itself and why there's such a big connection, because we have the original depictions of Godzilla here, the one top bracket right in the middle, the biggest one, with the extremely large head, very thick but small legs, and more like fish scaly-esque skin, which pulls more directly from dinosaur depictions at the time, and you can move to the right of it, that's an official Godzilla manga adaptation where it shares more in common with the statue below us, where it's just, instead of having Godzilla with his traditional appearance, ears, fangs, toes, etc., being what he is, he's just a very, very fat T-Rex. Like if you look there in the red, it is super wide. I'm not sure exactly why. I guess because they didn't want to draw the scales, like, oh, they'll make him a little fatter, so therefore they have to compensate for the spine. But he still has his atomic breath and everything. It's just the design that's really off. And what's interesting to note is that the depiction of Godzilla standing next to the Dai building and this Godzilla design here with it being just a big guy T-Rex is very similar to this T-Rex statue, which was in one museum and got transferred to another. On the two pictures on the far right, the bottom there, one with Honda and the other one there, that one in the middle is still from Frankenstein Congress World. That was when that T-Rex statue was still in that original museum. And that like the picture of Honda was on production of Frankenstein Congress World. And unfortunately wasn't able to fit it in here, but the mural itself, it's interesting because it and the statue itself pull a lot from different paleo depictions of the Tyrannosaurus. So you can't see it from this angle, but they also recreate the Leaping Laylabs picture from Charleston and there, but with brown colors instead of green. The T-Rex itself pulls similarly from the Knights, although it has this rough spine that run down it, which is something that they didn't depict in its T-Rex, but instead Laylabs having, of course, Laylabs now being called Tryptosaurus, would have these spines that run down the tail. You know, something that Salinger would include in his T-Rex. But the head itself of this statue is similar to some depictions of Knight's T-Rex, but also those of, again, Paleoartist David Drury, who worked on the depiction of the Foghorn. And it's interesting to note because Japan was getting a lot of paleo depictions from Eastern Europe as well as Western Europe and America itself, and how it was depicting its dinosaurs. And with the statue, you just kind of bulk up the bottom legs, make the arms a little bigger, and give it spines. You essentially got the original Cant design of Godzilla almost to a T, which is interesting to know. And then finally, we're getting into like beginning of the hype for Godzilla, where Godzilla's released in 1956 of Godzilla King of the Monsters, and that is after Godzilla Raised Against or even now appears in Japan, and then in 1959 you have Gigantus the Fire Monster. And what this does is that it cements in the ideas of American viewers who become a big contributor to Godzilla's perception across the world of what Godzilla is. Of course, there's a big discussion in the way region about how much political and as well as theming that's removed from King of Monsters. Not as much as I think I believe, but it is still relevant to note. And a lot of Gigantus is so heavily edited that a lot of people will just not see it at all, although I think it is important historically because of how people were treating the idea of Godzilla or the dinosaur monsters. They weren't just characters like they were in Japan, but more rather single like one-off creatures that can appear and maybe die. And we'll get another one. It may look the same, but it's a completely different monster. Guys, trust me, it's not Godzilla. Schweigman himself, when he had gotten rights to it, he thought that American audiences wouldn't want a sequel, but also that they'd be confused because Godzilla died in the last film. So he had said that he called it Gigantus because he didn't want people to confuse with Godzilla. Now, I don't think that makes sense. I think everyone probably agrees with that. Like, given the fact that in the movie itself you see footage of the 54 Godzilla, so probably, I think, rightly so, he said it's like one of the audience members obviously were fooled by this. But this dinosaur diatribe is important, I believe, because Hayama would say this, where he had kind of lamented on where the direction the Godzilla series was going after Raids Again, and he recalls one time in a dentist's office where a child had looked at an issue like magazine and seen a dinosaur and called it Godzilla. And he had said that any creature from the geological past that looks like a reptile had become a Godzilla, and then he goes on to say penguins. But it's very clear it came out even in Japan as well, especially with younger viewers or maybe disengaged older viewers, that Godzilla wasn't a specific character or a unique entity in itself, but just a dinosaur. And it's interesting to note here where I have these two pictures from Daikaiju, the manga itself, where he's talking about dinosaurs walking like Godzilla, even though the picture above is the animated specimen of Tyrannosaurus, but it's mixed with a Montosaurus skull for some reason. And these depictions of dinosaurs having the tails dragging was common way before Godzilla appeared, but Godzilla, because it had captured the minds of so many people, and it superseded this idea. And that's why oftentimes if you look at some dinosaur books that historically go over the history of dinosaurs, they say they walk like Godzilla, even if Godzilla himself is predated by these depictions, which is interesting to note. But we get now into how Godzilla is now overtaking other things in culture, more specifically cryptozoology, with this creature which was known as the Antarctic Godzilla. There were sightings from the 1930s up until 1957, although specifically it was termed the Arctic Godzilla in 1950, where a researcher had seen a creature, only really seen the top of the head, a little bit of the body. It was hairy. It didn't even look like Godzilla, but it was just this massive thing in the water. And he had said it was almost Godzilla-like creature, and then things sank a little ways. They never saw it again. But he himself, this researcher, thought it was the same creature that someone thought they saw in the 1930s. And then later on, in 1957, someone said they saw another large creature in that same general area. And this idea of the quote-unquote Antarctic Godzilla became more common. In the picture in the middle, the really greenish Godzilla there, that was a cryptozoology magazine that had one of the idea of this being the Antarctic Godzilla, and they just showed Godzilla attacking a research vessel. When the far left, that is more accurately what the researcher described. So it looked nothing like Godzilla. And on the two pictures, the blue ones on the far right, those are creatures inspired by the Antarctic Godzilla, not the Antarctic Godzilla itself, but that legend sort of inspired the creatures as a result. And I have a plesiosaur there only because this is coming off of 1950, 1957 when this creature is believed to have been sighted. And similarly to the Loch Ness Monster, it is the first time you actually hear about the Loch Ness Monster possessing the typical plesiosaur traits that we associate with it, is coming from one specific person. And he had just recently seen King Kong at that time. This was in 1933 when he saw the creature, George Spicer. He had seen King Kong, and the entire sighting he saw was a hoax, but because he was so inspired by the dinosaurs of King Kong, he had attributed these plesiosaur traits to the Loch Ness Monster legend, which had been going on at the time, and that's how you get the idea of Nessie itself being a long-lost plesiosaur. Now, going into Western takes and responses, this is in 1954, about 61. So, at the time, there were other like American and other Eastern and Western countries that were tackling the idea of these dinosaur-like creatures. Now, on the left here, this is the panels from Human Torch. Now, this isn't Johnny Storm Human Torch. This is the Human Torch, Japan, from 1954, actually. This is released in April of 1954, so it also predates Godzilla. But the story revolves around a nuclear bomb test in the middle of America, irradiating this egg. And it just so talks about the green T-Rex who, due to the radiation, begins to grow in size and ultimately starts to attack cities, which causes the Human Torch to intercept and fight against them. And ultimately the creature, ironically enough, is killed as they drive it into the water because of its weight and ends up drowning, which is interesting to note given how Godzilla was associated with sea life and the sea monster. And then we also have Tales of Astonish, which was Monster Dreams World was another reproduction of it. And that is Drone the Living Lizard, where in a similar vein they're working on a neurosis serum, which is alluded to having some kind of radioactive element to it, which irradiates this prehistoric lizard, which grows in size and becomes this, again, greenish Godzilla-like creature. We'll get to green why it's becoming associated with Godzilla world later. But as Drone continues to grow and grow, he gets even larger, large enough to actually swat high-flying planes out of the sky. Ultimately, they pull a camera on him and lure him towards a rocket ship, which just blasts him off into space. And due to wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff, as Dr. Wu would say, he ends up in the past, and that's how his species ends up reproducing and essentially time-loops itself into happening in the story itself. But you now have the giant behemoth, which was released in 1959, so this is like around the same time Gigantus is coming out. And for the original design of the behemoth, before it was the more quadrupedal Retrosaurus as design, they wanted it to be a more bipedal creation. And even then, they didn't even want it to, it wasn't originally named a dinosaur at all. It was actually a blob story of a radioactive blob. But they wanted something similar to the beast of 20,000 fathoms, and ultimately decided on making it more reptilian and going from bipedal to then quadrupedal and resembling the Retrosaurus as a result. But it still maintains that radioactive element, whether it's inspired by Godzilla or not. It's interesting to note that they kept that angle for this creature instead of just making it almost a one-to-one remake of the beast of 40,000 fathoms. But then you have Gorgo from 1961. Now Gorgo itself, due to the success that the people had on distributing Rodan, which came out in 56, there was discussions on trying to have a monster film of their own. And they originally wanted to send it in Japan, so it's very clear that Gorgo shares a lot of its gameplay with Godzilla as a result, but ultimately wanted to send it out there and moving it into America, but then they decided no, we'll do it in the UK, and that's how Gorgo ends up becoming the Brick Guy's monster. So, as we're getting more and more monsters, it's a decade of myth at this point for Godzilla. From 1954 to about 1965, that's about the same amount of length we're getting to the point with Monsterverse now, and how Godzilla has changed from 2014 up until Godzilla's Kong New Empire. And you go from Godzilla becoming this very destructive, rampaging creature with these deep themes, to still having deeper themes, but them changing and becoming more kid-friendly in King Kong vs. Godzilla. And that continues to be the case until Invasion of Astro Monster in 1965. But with Godzilla, the myth of Godzilla becomes more important. And though myths are important to us foundationally, there's an idea where the myth and like the truisms of the myth become what people think of, and that's how you get things like the common idea of Godzilla, cultural osmosis, things of that nature. So we oftentimes have for specific characters, their appearance and what is generally known or the behavior of the myth. So Godzilla stops being specifically about nuclear weapons, the fear of them, the danger of that war coming in, being more about the appearance of Godzilla being essentially a giant sea creature, kind of looks like a dinosaur, and he shoots a fire gun. A lot of people think of, if you ask someone who's not a Godzilla fan or vaguely familiar with Godzilla, that's oh, it is pretty big soon, fire. And with the behavior of the myth, again, less key plot details and more about, oh, Godzilla comes ashore, maybe destroys some cities, fights the military, and if there's another monster, he'll have to team up with it or he'll fight against it. And that becomes what most people commonly know about Godzilla, and if they're less engaged. But what's interesting to note is that although these are the films that came out in Japan, they didn't come out that order in America or even in the rest of the world, at least looking at America specifically. Astro Monster doesn't come out until like the 70s. And Godzilla vs. Sea Monster comes out before then, so does Son of Godzilla, although both those are TV, and then you have Destroy Monsters coming out before Invasion of Astro Monster and Monster Zero as it's known actually comes out. So this idea of what people know about Godzilla begins to change over there in America, and it's right around this time too the kaiju boom begins to happen in Japan from like about 1964 up until 1967. And looking at these ones in particular, you have Agon, the Atomic Dragon. I know outside I saw a little poster that said, praise be to Agon. So Agon itself was originally planned for 1964, and it's about, it's almost copyright infringement. It kind of is, and why it has that dual year there is ultimately because of what happens here, where Shinichi Sekizawa was the writer behind Agon, and Toho was like, nope, we're not doing that. Here's your clause, no compete, so you can't release this. And they're like, well, okay, so we can't do that. So Agon doesn't get released until 1968. But what's interesting to know about Agon specifically is that the suit itself would appear earlier in Ambassador Magma as the creature Aron. And there were some like dual modifications, such as, ironically enough, he got fangs, which is again closer to Godzilla. If you look at other pictures of Agon itself, it's almost like a Godzilla design with very, very reduced spines there. So that's interesting to note. And then next year in 1965, where Frankenstein conquers the world, and Baragon. Now, for Godzilla fans, Baragon is his own unique monster, his own unique entity. But what's interesting to note is the history of Godzilla, King Kong, and Frankenstein is that you go from early on, O'Brien wanted potentially be a King Kong versus Frankenstein. That goes and becomes King Kong versus the Ginkgo into King Kong versus Godzilla. And Toho was kind of fucking around with the idea of Godzilla fighting Frankenstein. And then ultimately you get King Kong versus Godzilla, but they still wanted to use Frankenstein. They were thinking of having Godzilla fight Frankenstein next, but that ultimately doesn't end up being the case. And they changed kind of the roles where originally Frankenstein was going to be the more antagonistic monster. And instead of that, they had Frankenstein being the more sympathetic character. And replacing Godzilla with another reptilian monster, Baragon. Now, a lot of people associate Baragon with being more dog-like, but in the picture, which I also showed the dinosaurs, Baragon is a dinosaur that is awakened in the modern day, rears up on its hind legs, and shoots a heat ray. But because of how unique Baragon is aesthetically, and having his own film technically outside of the Godzilla franchise, he's able to cement himself as his own unique entity, but still ends up being part of the team of all the monsters, which adjacently could be considered not Godzillas. And then you have Gamma. Now, Gamma, of course, a very unique monster later on appealing to kids, and the trilogy with Nathaniel being what really cements Gamma as his character, the unique traits we think of the character. But originally Gamma, he's very similar to Godzilla. We have him essentially a pretty short holdover. He's awakened by nuclear weapons, and there is a tribe of people that had worshipped or talked about the monster for generations before he's revived, bringing breath weapon. But of course, the unique traits of Gamma being his design being so drastically different from Godzilla, and the fact that the turtle can fly. So he's already cemented himself far away from Godzilla, and you see that even by after Gamma versus Baragon, which is he kind of carries over some traits of Gamma from his first film, but it's by Gamma versus Gauss especially. Later on, where the friend of the moniker and his more fun, happy-go-lucky kind of attitude becomes more cemented. And then we have here in 1966, Godzilla, which is a lost film from India. We don't know too much about this film or really about its design, but it's something where you see it here within this range of the 60s, where other productions were coming out in 1966, particularly being diverted to something that the previous panels were talking about, which we'll get into. But we have next Yongguri. Now, Yongguri is a Korean production, and the suit itself is modeled by the people who work at Daiei, which is why when you look at its suit, Yongguri has a lot in common with the Daiei Gamma suits and the Daikaiju, with a lot of iconic components as well as a more unique abilities to it. And of course, with Yongguri, you have plates standing up, they're upon its design, inspired, although of course you get the horn, which makes it copyright safe, so you can't sue them. And the spines aren't exactly the same, but what's also interesting to note too is that Yongguri at the time was one of the more expensive films to be produced in Korea. And it also shows Korea as a society being more self-reliant as compared to how it actually was at the time post-Korean War. And that's also similar to Godzilla, where in 1954, the self-defense forces established, and Japan itself was a more self-reliant entity, even though at the time there were still American bases as there are today at the time. So it's showing through these fictitious works the idea of these nations being able to handle themselves in the wake of disasters like giant monsters. But going back to 1966, it's the birth of Ultraman, and more specifically Ultra Q, with probably more famous examples of I can't believe it's not Godzilla's, but Gomez and Jiras. Gomez itself being the first monster that we heard in Ultra Q, being a modified Monster Gojo suit from versus Godzilla, having a shell, the split tail, the details along the stomach, the horns, fur, and the like. And ultimately, having Anno reference this in the beginning of Shin Ultraman, where they have the Shin Ultra Q section with Shin Gomez being a modified Shin Godzilla. So that carries on even as late as Shin Ultraman. And with Jiras itself, that is the most obvious, I can't believe it's not Godzilla. And you have not one but two Godzilla suits actually mashed together. You have the Monster Gojo body having been remodified into the Godzilla suit, and the head being the Invasion of Master Monster Godzilla head being stitched onto that body because of how radically modified Gomez's head is. They were able to modify it back to Godzilla. And as a result, Toho also wanted the Godzilla suit back. So I was like, I'm going to take these now, I'm going to use them. And as a result, just to make them not Godzilla, stick grill on them, paint a little green, put a little yellow, maybe we've got Jiras. And of course, you have the newer Jiras that was last year's G-Fest. And now you have all the Baragon descendants. From the top, you have Patlish and Ultra Q, Naranga, Magular, and Kabora from the original Ultraman. And it's only because of the fact that you have Godzilla vs. Frankenstein falling through that you get Baragon, and from Baragon, Subaru gets a lot of mileage with that suit, because you get all of these monsters as a result, and a lot of other monsters later on in the Ultra series go on to reference that just general body plan from Baragon. But even still, you also get other monsters as well. Earthtron and from Return of Ultraman as well, and then Tamaga from Ultraman X, having that general Godzilla-like shape, heat ray, things of that nature, but still distinguishing themselves in ways that make them just not repeats of Godzilla. But then you have other creatures as well, or the Kyodai Hero fodder. Again, on the far right, that is not Agon, it is Aron. Completely different. There is no relation. Maybe like a second, third cousin removed. I don't really know, they didn't tell me. But then you have, from Toho itself, the one in the middle, that is Tsujijiro or Tsujizilla. It is literally called Tsujijiro there, and it looks like essentially Godzilla mixed with Gamora. Of course, Gamora itself having similar Godzilla traits, but this image itself so much where you can't really call it Gamora just Godzilla. But then you have on this far left here, this is Balgodon from Spectreman 1971, which, if you remove all the little details on it, give us a spine, that could be that kind of ratty Godzilla suit from like the 70s there. It's really noticeable just how similar that is. But getting into the 60s and the 70s, this is where the image of Godzilla really gets cemented as big green dinosaur, like I was mentioning with the idea of myth. At the bottom here, you have Turok, which actually released in 1954 in America. Of course, people know about Turok probably from the games from like the N64 and the like, and the comics from that time. But originally Turok was just Native American in a valley dinosaur, very valley watching-esque. But this is the original image for Turok. Turok being pulled up by a dinosaur, and this international poster for Godzilla vs. Hedorah, they literally just essentially traced over that Turok picture, and there you go, bada bing, bada boom, you have Godzilla. Well, right above that Turok picture, it's interesting to note that usually Turok uses a lot of retro dinosaurs, but in this case, it's one of the few times where a dinosaur can appear as a hybrid of two. Instead of a T-Rex with a Stegosaurus, it's a T-Rex with a Ankylosaurus. So another hybrid dinosaur-esque creature. And as Godzilla again becomes more popular in America in the 70s with the 71 Marvel run, Godzilla is now cemented fully as a giant green dinosaur that shoots fire, and that is the idea that people run with up until a lot of the day, especially a lot of older fans. And this is where things like the Monsters Mash is there, like Goria brings Monsters of Finland become really common, and this is where the idea of monster kids erupts. And specifically in Monster Times, Godzilla was voted the most popular monster, beating out Dracula and King Kong. And of course, you have things like the Roar Godzilla, again, big green dinosaur, and then you have Kona, Monster Island, Star Spangled War stories, and Worlds Unknown, where you have these dinosaurs with these either exaggerated spine designs in the back, which seem to invoke Godzilla without explicitly being Godzilla themselves. But the one on the top right there is very much a Godzilla homage, which is Weird War. Now, Weird War is a subgenre in and of itself, and this was essentially an anthology of different characters in World War II dealing with either like wonder weapons, supernatural threats, of the sort. And in this case, the U.S. is fighting against the Japanese and deployed this new terror weapon, which is Rotila, the dinosaur monster. In the comic itself, they explicitly mention whether this is like something like King Kong, like a fictitious tale. They find out the monster is actually real and plans to move towards Pearl Harbor and attack from there, commit another Pearl Harbor with blue laws to their mainland. And in order to intercept this monster, they end up using a nuclear submarine, which they are sacrificing a ship, battleship in the process, which is reminiscent in the way of Godzilla-like went to Cal in Godzilla -1. And after that ship is sunk, they follow Rotira back into the dreadnought where they're keeping the monster, and ultimately self-destruct this nuclear sub, and essentially nuke the monster and kill it, which is interesting to note. It's a Godzilla reference, a lot of guys that use potato, I guess. But going in now, and how it really echoes of Monster Kids, where there's not as much Godzilla stuff going on from Japan, but you're still getting the echoes of it. People who grew up on Godzilla being interested in Godzilla, still referencing it now as they become older. So, top left there, you have the Dino King toy. It's not Godzilla. I know it's got the, like a maple leaf spine. It's a single row. Please don't sue us, I don't do that. And then to the right, you have Daikaiju-fanboy, or Age of Great Dinosaurs, with a big green T-Rex where its entire plot is chasing these kids, and every single one that comes out of this guy's mouth is just Godzilla's roar. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's just Godzilla's roar. And then this, it looks like a dinosaur, but it's actually the monster Godzilla. It's from a turn-based action game on a 2D grid now. It was called Crush, Crumble, and Chomp. And as you can see here, they just made a dinosaur. There's no spines, there's nothing, no flair. It is literally just a dinosaur. I think that it's clear for a lot of people that Godzilla is just a big dinosaur. So I guess in order also to avoid getting copyright struck, you have to make it just a dinosaur. And as you can see here, we have these step Godzilla designs. So those are the rumors of a Godzilla movie being made. And the same guy who was working on the film, that is that little shot right there of the history of Godzilla, that was from Friday the 13th. Same director was going to be working on that first American Godzilla production, Godzilla and Monsters. And the one to the right of it is a thing from Doctor Who, where someone just transforms into what is ostensibly just the Marvel Godzilla design with reduced fins. And then to the right of it, you have the various depictions of the Tarrasque from Dungeons and Dragons. So what you have here are the top one in black and white and the small one next to it are the early depictions of the Tarrasque when D&D was first released. But it's until the 80s where the Tarrasque starts to take on the more explicitly reptilian-like traits. And this is also where the lore about it being this singular constructed force that's often awakened by like people messing with magic, working below the ground, and essentially just being like a king of the monster that Godzilla for all intents and purposes. And now going into Return of the King of Godzilla from 84 up until Godzilla vs. Destroyer in 1995, we'll start to get a few other characters now. We'll start with her at the bottom right there, Lizzie. A lot of people assume Lizzie itself is a Godzilla pastiche, but in fact, she's not. She's actually based on Mir from 20 Million Miles to Earth. Someone had asked the creator of Rampage at the time whether this was from Godzilla, and he thought that, well, Godzilla's too big for the scale we're trying to do this game. So it was actually based on Harryhausen monsters, which kind of makes sense since you have George being based off of Kong. So Ymir, Harryhausen with Brian makes sense, and then Raph was essentially just a cow song there. But then you have Beyond from King of Monsters, Pulgasari, and you have this one from Tales, which is Godzilla, which made him more of like the Godzillas at the time. And then there's the Dormy Godzilla, some of you probably had it, or you've seen them in the dealer's room if you've been there. So these started popping up around 1986. And then you have this little rat-looking Godzilla here, which is from a series called Mini Goddesses. It's from episode 7 and 8. And essentially, the little rat has some moldy food becomes a Godzilla. And then right above him next to Kira is Godzilla from Pinky and the Brain. So it's around this time we're starting to see more references to Godzilla rather than create characters that are known franchises. And I think everyone knows about Pokemon, I guess. They were originally inspired by the capsule monsters, and ultimately you have characters like Tyranitar from '99, Excalibur from 2020, and obviously with that you have a lot of references to social because of that. And moving into the millennium, you have all of these characters, Togero, which people know from War of the Monsters, Godzilla, which is a terrifying creature, and more interesting Godzilla from Star Wars. So this is now more commonly you see creatures in video games itself becoming more common in these shows and TV and the like. And now in the new area, you have things like Rawa, Megalon from Dawn of the Monsters, and respectively, Godzilla from King of Tokyo, which now has an official Godzilla expansion, and then Gaiju the Gigantus Haligon from Kaiju Caramelized and the American Kaiju. But these are really the last few you see of them, and when you get to like at this point, around 2020 onward, you start seeing these Godzillas because you're just able to license the real thing, and that's why you start seeing them falling off at this point. It's just more direct crossover for characters, and that's where you get into things like just fan homages, where a lot of these are creations of friends of mine or just other artists online, and it's really clear just how important Godzilla or not Godzilla someday in terms of inspiring creators and the like. So that's really about it. I can take some questions off to the side so I can start getting the other people's panel on. So thank you guys all for listening and enjoy.